Before the podcast, I wanted to give you an overview of today's topic. It's about a cult here in Australia called The Family. The Family was a cult here in Australia, and it was run by Anne Hamilton Byrne, who had a lot of influential people as members. They were members of law enforcement, psychiatrists, social workers, and other people of society in Melbourne. The cult was responsible for the illegal adoption of babies from the 1970s onwards. The children grew up on a remote property in rural Victoria, Australia, and were looked after by what was known as the aunties, people who obeyed every word the cult leader Anne Hamilton Byrne said. Their lives were not easy, and they were constantly under physical, emotional, and mental abuse. Here is a conversation I had with the lead detective. Hello and welcome to Life Changes You. I'm Daniel and it's good to have you back again. We're now in the new year, which is fantastic. I mean, we've been going just over 2 years now, 145 episodes. So obviously we're talking about things that people are interested in, which is really good. And I'm loving all the feedback that I'm getting. So thank you very much. And I will get back to you as soon as I can. Today, I've got a really special guest. He's called Lex Van Man, and we're talking about a cult that was in Australia from the 70s, I think until mid-80s, maybe 90s, and it was called The Family. And so Lex is currently the CEO of Victoria Police Legacy. So hello, Lex, how are you?
Hi, Daniel. I'm good, thank you.
Thank you for coming on. I was very excited when we got introduced. And as I said to you before, I have a bit of a thing about reading about cults and wondering why they're started and why people are involved in them, how they get, manipulated into them. But yours is a different story because it's from a different angle, I guess, than most people would actually get to speak to someone about. So would you like to say what you are and what you've done in your life?
What I've done in my life, my work life. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer of Victoria Police Legacy. I've been there since June 2016.
Right.
And before that, I had a 20-year career with the Country Fire Authority, the CFA in Victoria, where I was initially a regional director in charge of a number of different parts of Victoria for 15 years, and then my last 5 years of service with the CFA was as the Executive Director responsible for volunteerism and for training.
Wow.
And prior to that, I was a police officer with Victoria Police for 18 years. And during my time at CFA as Regional Director, I was also a councillor, local councillor on the Shire of Nillumbik in Melbourne's north-eastern suburbs. And of those 5 years, I was 2 years as mayor. So I've had a bit of a raft of experience across a number of disciplines, let me put it that way.
I'm learning more about you now. I didn't realise you were a mayor as well.
Well, there you go. You never know who pops up, do you?
No. So your career in the police force, you must have covered lots of different investigations and crimes and I have spoken to other police before, not on the podcast, but your lives never seem not boring, but, you've always got something that you're working on or thinking about or working towards. So do you want to give us an overview of this cult, The Family, which was by Anne Hamilton Byrne, and how you sort of came across it in the first place?
Well, I suppose I'll take you back on a journey back to December 1987.
Wow.
To a school fire that happened in Monbulk, a primary school fire in the last week of December, just before Christmas. And I was in the arson bomb squad at that stage, and I was part of a three-man on-call crew. We used to do on-call on weekly rotations. So, early in the morning, we received a phone call that there'd been a fire at a school. And so we, myself and one other detective, we turned up at the Monbulk school and started to investigate the fire.
Yeah.
What its cause was, and more so from our point of view, was it a malicious fire, and if so, who may have lit the fire? There was a classroom that was destroyed, and so forth. So as part of the avenues of inquiry, as we call it, I spoke to the principal and said, whose classroom was this, and he indicated who the teacher was. And then just some further inquiries led me to ask some questions about one of the pupils, because in a school fire, often if it's a room, it might be somebody's got a vent against that. Picture. So I found out the name of this child that was in the class, and was told that he had been or was still part of this cult called the Family, and I hadn't really heard of the Family. And so I spoke to the local regional police doctor part-time, and he told me this amazing story that this child had been part of this religious cult called the Family, and that the Family was based in the beautiful Mount Dandenong Ranges, and that the leader of the cult, a woman by the name of Anne Hamilton Byrne, that her followers believed that she was Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form. Well, at that point, Daniel, I thought, boy, this doctor's got some real bad psychiatric problems, And it wasn't soon after that I found out that what I was being told was true. There was this cult of up to 500 followers of very well-to-do, smart people in some very senior positions and disciplines in the community sector that believed that Anne was Jesus Christ reincarnated in a female form. So we started to look into the school fire, and this cult really started to interest me.
Yeah.
After about 3 months of looking into that, we couldn't establish who lit the school fire, and I was told by my then superiors to drop this issue about the cult.
Yeah.
Because I was told, children had been taken from birth, the falsification of passports and birth certificates. And there was something in there, but the local community policing squad, as it was called in those days, because you've got to remember we're back in the 80s now, they had tried to get an investigation up and running, but, in those days, matters to do with children was seen more as a community services type of thing, not really a policing thing. So I dropped it after 3 months officially, but kept my hand in and kept talking to the people at the community policing squad. I got to know a number of the children who turned out had been released in a raid that had occurred in the August of 87 from a property up at Ilden, and they called it Up Top. And it was this secluded house that was actually run like a private school. The kids were educated there, and all these children had been taken by authorities, Federal Police, Victoria Police, and Department of Human Services, after one of the girls had escaped and told this amazing story about her brothers and sisters. Yeah, and they were all, the majority of them had their hair peroxide blonde and so forth, and they all believed that their mother was Anne Hamilton Byrne and father was Bill Hamilton Byrne, Anne's second husband. So I met a couple of the girls, and one in particular, following the school fire and the discussion with the police doctor. And I was just fascinated that nothing had been done. So I kept my hand in, and I was fortunate that in the June of 1989, I was asked to review a few files about the cult and whether something should be done. So I put a report together, and I spent 2 weeks out at the eastern suburbs, out at the then Nunawading police headquarters, and I put a report together that said, there is certainly prima facie evidence of child stealing and the administration of drugs to children. Yeah. So I basically forced the hand of the department in those days to do something about it. So in December 1989, I received a phone call from the head of the drug squad because I'd mentioned LSD and psilocybin, the drugs that had been administered to the children. I was given to the drug squad to deal with. So the detective chief inspector at the time there rang me. I was a sergeant by this stage at the old Russell Street police station, and said, we're going to establish this task force of a senior sergeant, a sergeant and 4 detectives. We want you to be the sergeant. and you've got 12 weeks to clean it up. 12 weeks. So
it doesn't seem very long to sort through all that.
No, I fronted up in this room on a Monday morning with a senior sergeant who I didn't know, 4 detectives I didn't know, no resources apart from 4 empty desks and 4 empty filing cabinets, no car. So remember, this is basically pre-internet.
Yeah. So, I mean, you didn't really even have computers to work things out on.
No, and given 12 weeks to sort it out. And that's, that 12 weeks for me personally started then a 4.5-year journey.
Wow.
Still 13 police members go through the task force at varying times. And at the end, I was the only one that was left of the original 6 that started on the task force. And the last 12 months of it, I was the senior investigator, the acting senior sergeant, detective senior sergeant, with writing instructions to finish it off and clean it up, which the team I had at the time, we did a great job. And well, the rest is history. We brought them back from the United States, and they fronted the courts. So that's a quick overview of my involvement. And of course, there's a lot of infill there for the 4.5 years that I was on.
Yeah, because, I mean, in 4.5 years, you covered so much stuff. And for those who are listening, you were actually in, I think it was a movie in America, wasn't it, for about the cult? But here it was an ABC special in Australia called Children of the Cult. So if people were... Yeah, there was... wanting to have a look at that. I mean, I did some research. When I spoke to you last week, I said, look, I've just rewatched it. I had watched it when it came out in 2017. And there was lots of information in there. So, yes, your 4.5 years, you've summed it up so succinctly, but there was so much that happened for you and the other people involved, wasn't there? There was,
and, the docudrama that was done and launched in the 2016 Melbourne International Film Festival, and followed up by what you indicated, the 3-part series on the ABC, plus the book that was written, was about my desire to make sure that the story was told so that people knew that this bizarre thing that happened wasn't some deep southern state, United States cult. No. It was actually happened on the doorsteps of Melbourne.
Yeah.
The second most populated city in Australia, and also to serve as a reminder to those in authority that, and the community, that, whilst our systems and processes are much better these days, and our accountabilities are much, much better, and there's a greater focus on child abuse and all things to do with children.
Yeah.
That, when asked many times since the investigation and the drama and the docudrama, could this happen again? I've said, I doubt it could happen again, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen again. Yeah. And that was part of the education process that I wanted to see happen in publicising what this thing was all about, because, it involved senior members of the legal fraternity, involved senior members of the medical fraternity, psychiatrists who were administering LSD into people, into children. It was nurses, it was social workers, it was school principal that was involved. So it wasn't, it wasn't the people that you would think wouldn't be involved in this. These were smart people that became infatuated with Anne through their own medical issues and how they actually began to see Anne as Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form, and as I said at the time of her death. When you were saying about it being, in Melbourne, I mean, for people who are overseas who are listening, where Lake Eildon is, where one of the schools was, is about 2 hours from Melbourne. But in summertime, there's loads of houseboats and everything up there, isn't there? So it was near to where the children were. Yeah, it's about 2.5 hours northeast of Melbourne in rural Victoria. And it's a large lake, man-made lake in part. And, there's hundreds of houseboats on there every summer holidays, school holidays, long weekends and weekends as people going up there. And it was a great cover for Anne and the cult to actually use that. And, what made it even bizarre was, the education inspector actually visited the school on a number of occasions, and they'd had a classroom set up in the lounge room and a blackboard and so forth. And, they got a gold star. Yeah, it's a great school. When the kids were told that when the police came, to hide in a secreted spot under the house that had been made, because the sole role of police in society was to kill children.
Yeah.
And they believed it. That's what they believed. So they were terrified, when the raid happened in August 1987. And this is the evil thing that this woman and her followers did. And they were not dumb people. They were smart people. And, there was two particular nurses who the children called aunties, who would work 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off at Uptop at Lake Eildon, taking care of the children. And on their down 2 weeks, when they weren't up there, they were working in hospitals in Melbourne, and their wage they paid for the food and the upkeep of the children on the next 2 weeks. So they paid for the cabbages for the soup and the monthly food the kids had and so forth.
Yeah.
And there was a school principal that was actually preparing the lessons for the kids. And then he would go up on weekends to ensure that the aunties had instructed the kids in what the school lessons were. And the kids were highly educated, highly educated. But they were under the misbelief of who they were. And a number of them were taken from their natural mothers at the time of their births, and other natural mothers were deceived as to where the children were going to.
Yeah.
And you've got to remember, this is in the 70s now, the late 70s, early 80s. And the view of the society in those days of a 15, 16, 17-year-old unmarried girl
was terrible.
Pregnant was atrocious. And so often, out of shame, families would secrete their daughters away for 9 months and then all of a sudden they would turn up as if nothing had happened.
And those poor mothers who gave up their children, like when they're 15, 16, 17, would have no idea where these kids were going to. They're thinking they're going somewhere better.
Well, we spoke to a number. Obviously, one of the aspects of the investigation was to ensure that we could identify who the maternal and paternal parents of these children were. And on a number of occasions when we knocked on the door to actually ask, of course, there was often shock, horror that, we thought we knew who the people were.
Yeah.
And, it's one of the first times that DNA samples were used in Victoria to prove that closeness. And on a number of occasions, as soon as the door opened, I looked at the parent and I went, "Oh yeah, you are the parent." It was just there. So these young girls, more so the parents of the young girls, made these girls give up their children. And, a number of the children who are obviously now adults, and many of them very well settled back in the community and themselves become parents and so forth. They just lived a life of deceit all the way through, they'd been lied to all the way through until they were extricated from the cult.
Yeah, well, when I was watching part of the documentary yesterday, there was one of the girls on there, and she said that when the police came up and sort of said to them, "Are you well looked after? Do you have enough to eat?" She said, "Well, yes, I do have enough to eat." And she said, "Well, of course, I didn't know any different. So what I had to eat, I thought was plenty. But once I got out and I realised what you could eat, I realised that, well, no, I wasn't getting enough to eat."
Correct.
I mean, from a young age, they've just been almost brainwashed and manipulated into the way Anne Hamilton Byrne wanted them to be. So they knew nothing different to what was going on there.
Absolutely. They were made into a group of singers. Anne had a fascination with the choir, her family becoming like a choir, like the Von Trapp family singers from The Sound of Music. She took them to the Dandenong singing festival, folk festival. And there they were, and they sang, all dressed up the same and so forth, with the majority of them with their blonded peroxide hair and so forth. They all believed that Anne and William were their mother and father, and they didn't learn that until, that they were released in their early teens or by the police in 87.
And some of the children that were actually in the cult were actually cult followers' children, weren't they?
Yeah, well, so there are a number of cult members that, I'll give you one example. One cult member who I spoke to a number of years ago after the investigation closed relayed the story where her son was 2.5 years of age. And Anne rang her and said, you're not raising your child right. He's now mine. Bring him to me.
Oh, God.
So the next time she saw him was when he was 18. So they just blind obedience to the Almighty, and that's the power and the charisma she had over these people. And the cult itself, when you think about how it started in the late 60s or in the 1960s through a fellow by the name of Raynor Johnson, who was a master of Queen's College.
Yes.
And Raynor Johnson was a British physicist who'd been involved in the the development of weapons and so forth during World War II and all that type of thing. And he was seen by the Melbourne education fraternity at the University of Melbourne as a key prize if they could get him to be the master of Queen's College, which is one of our most eminent colleges in Victoria, academic colleges. And the position of master is extremely high position. Yeah. So he came out to Australia and he was dabbling in Eastern mythology and how it related to Christianity. And I have a personal view that dear old Raynor was going, crazy. Yeah. Senile as part of this. And the story goes that he saw Anne one day at the university, and Anne went to his home with some others, saw Anne and said he'd seen the Messiah. And from there, the cult grew. So, it was through Dr. Raynor Johnson, and then there was a number of leading psychiatrists in those days who had been licensed to use the drug LSD. Yeah. The experimental drug is LSD on people. And there was a woman who owned a private nursing psychiatric home in Normandy Road, Kew, who followed Anne, became a follower of Anne's, and then so Anne used the private psychiatric hospital as basically, you could say, a grooming ground for future members. Yeah. And, in those days, again, you've got to remember it was in the late 60s and 70s, early 70s, for someone to be a lawyer or for someone to be a nurse, someone to be in the legal fraternity, someone to be a social worker and so forth, to publicly say that they were suffering from mental health would have been the end of their career.
Definitely.
Different today.
Yeah.
Totally different today. So they went to a private psychiatric hospital for help, and they were there ready for the picking. And that's exactly what Anne did.
And of course, once she got in with, I think you said his name was Raynor, once you're up in that caliber of people, then people under that sort of social grouping, so I guess teachers, people like that, would want to follow because Raynor's almost like a god because he's so well educated.
Well, you've got to remember in those days in universities in Australia, it was only, I think it was about the top 3% of students actually went to university.
Yeah.
It wasn't the university as we probably now know it today that anyone can go to a university. It was seen for those high achievers and those high academic achievers. And they became the barristers and the lawyers and the judges and the doctors and the specialists and so forth in their field. So, and it was a very small society, if I can put it that way, that academic society. So the networking was amazing at that level across the various professions. And if you've got somebody in a position of authority that's well regarded by the community, that position, you got to remember that in those days, if you said you're a bank manager or if you're a doctor or a teacher or a principal or a nurse, no one ever questioned your authority. You went, oh, wow. You felt subservient to that person because they were smarter than you because they'd been at university. And society then wasn't like it is today where it would question and challenge.
No, yeah. And that's what I was sort of getting at is like if you've got high profile people like that, then, yeah, people just take you as face value what you're saying. They don't question it.
Correct.
So with Anne, I mean, she started off, she does have a child of her own, doesn't she? But she claimed to have more children.
She had a much older daughter than the children that were
Oh, okay, yeah.
But Anne had a hysterectomy years before this started, so she could never have had children. And you know, I interviewed one of the former cult members who made the maternity dresses for Anne, and she said, you know, Anne always looked for years and years and years pregnant when I saw her.
Wow.
Well, that was just a little bump that she was wearing to perpetrate the lie.
But I guess that the cult members did believe that she was pregnant all the time.
Correct. You know, and you know, the cult was centered around Ferny Creek, Sassafras area, Mount Dandenong. They had the chapel, Santa Keaton Lodge. You know, Anne's followers, including Anne, basically owned a whole street.
Wow.
In the hills, except for one other house. And Anne was such a miserly type of person that she didn't pay for her own water. She had a hose line going across the street from one cult members to her place to get water for her house. You know, and Anne never paid for anything. It was always done by the cult members. You know, she had property in Tunbridge Wells in Kent in the United Kingdom, a place called Broome Farm. Had property in the Catskill Mountains in the United Kingdom. She spent time in Hawaii. So, you know, she was always gallivanting around the globe. And the aunties were taking care of the children at Eildon. And often when the children had been considered they had behaved poorly over something, Anne would ask the aunties to hold up the phone so she could hear the punishments being administered.
I know, it's awful to think that someone could be that controlling and be in another country. Correct.
So, you know, one of the things that I always remember about the task force is when, when I first got the phone call, we got the phone call that she'd been arrested following a joint FBI arrangement between ourselves, our task force, and the FBI office in New York, which is another story. And then when I went and to the United States with a small team to extradite her and her husband Bill, waiting in anticipation to meet her for the very first time. And I'll never forget the side door of this van, like a Mercedes-Benz vehicle, is probably, you would relate it, one of those univan type things.
Yeah.
The door slid open, and here was this crumpled, old-looking lady, no blonde wig that she always wore, no makeup, and this old bloke, you know, her husband, in leg irons and bracelets. And you would have thought, oh, you poor old lady, you know. I was just looking evil straight in the eye.
Yeah.
In the eye when I saw her that day.
In this documentary, it said that there were up to 28 that were there.
Yes, she says she had 27 children go through her fingers, go through her arms. We knew of 13.
Right.
Now, you know, what happened to the other 14, or were there an additional 14, or was that just her fantasy?
Yeah.
We don't know. And even the children that we spoke to and we got close to, whatever, you know, there was no others that they knew of. So
right, yeah.
So, you know, I tended to believe the children a lot more than a lot more than Anne. But yeah, so, you know, but it was also the manipulation of the cult members. You know, then at its peak in the late 60s, early 70s, it was over 500 professional people and their partners, wives, husbands, that were members of the cult and would go up to Santa Keaton Lodge for their services. And if Anne was out of the country, she would send back tape recordings, lessons, and they would all gather in the hall and they would play the tapes, you know, in front of the altar there, where her chair was.
Yeah.
And many of the followers had, in their private homes, had what they call a blue room, and it was basically a blue-coloured room. And I remember going into one house when we did a raid, and there was a small room off the hallway, and it was blue.
Yeah.
And there was a very small table, and there was the crucifix. There were blue crystals, and there was a picture of Anne in front of the crucifix. That's where he would pray.
Wow.
And he was a doctor. a general practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, look,
psychiatrist.
I can never get my head around how people like this, like taking the kids out of this, because they have no choice, freedom of choice in this, but how especially academic people could be sucked into following someone, because you'd think that they were the smartest people that we would know.
Yeah, but you've also got to understand how things happened. I can recount one of the stories that we were informed of and confirmed, and that was at the private psychiatric hospital. One of Melbourne's eminent architects had some issues due to a family issue, and went in there, was seen by a psychiatrist, and at night time in a dark room, he was given the drug LSD.
Yeah. And
under the power of the drug, he looked up, and before him was, this white figure in a flowing gown, white gown, with smoke coming up, like haze coming up behind her. In actual fact, that was Anne in a white gown. There was a bucket of dry ice behind her, and the dry ice was just giving off this stuff and giving this mist and so forth.
Yeah.
And he believed he'd seen Jesus Christ reincarnated when told he had.
Yeah.
And they came out of it and they'd seen the Lord. And then they were introduced to Anne, and that's how it happened. Simple as that. Blind following it. It's the human mind can be manipulated, and we've seen that over history in many different events.
Yeah.
And this is just another one of those events where the power of a human being can be so great over others.
So I guess, you said that Anne travelled all around the world and had properties everywhere. Did the followers, did they give her a certain amount of money each week? Was it like pay?
So with Broome Farm, they purchased the farm for her.
Right.
Number of them went over to the United Kingdom and did the maintenance and made it livable for Anne, and so forth. So, there wasn't the fortnightly subscription like subs or whatever.
Yeah.
But certainly if she needed money, she only had to ask for it and she was given it. There was properties that were purchased. There were land titles that were purchased. She would tell followers, for example, she would break marriages up and put this cult member with another cult member, and anyone that became a cult member didn't end up with the same partner at the end of it. She's very good at manipulating people. So all these children were all singles, but she created twins in New South Wales through falsification of birth certificates. She created triplets, and one example is in New Zealand. And we had inquiries done in New Zealand, where a handwriting expert went to New Zealand because she registered through a doctor, a cult member who was a New Zealander, doctor working in New Zealand. She registered twins. And at one point, she wanted the twins to actually be triplets. So she got a number of the cult followers who were a lawyer and social worker and doctor, and she wrote this affidavit basically saying, oh, look, when I gave birth to the twins, I actually had triplets. I didn't tell you about the third child. So the authorities in New Zealand just issued new birth certificates for triplets.
Wow.
Because people didn't question those things in those days.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So, and then, of course, you do that so you can get passports and identity and move kids around, because many of the children travelled overseas with Anne or Bill or with other cult members. So it was, and at the end of the day, it was a falsification of documents, perjury, that one led to the breakthrough in the case, which I can tell you briefly about, but secondly, actually ended up with the charges of perjury on documents that Anne and William were extradited from the United States back to face the court in Melbourne.
Yeah. You said in the documentary that there was a process with the extradition, and once you agree to terms of what you're going to extradite them on, then once they get here, you can't add other charges onto that.
Correct.
So how does that process work then?
So there's a whole process that happens is we had to get a warrant, arrest warrant.
Yep.
So it was one of the first times where, the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, as it was done in those days, actually appointed a prosecutor to work with the task force on what the best charges were.
Okay, I see.
For an extradition.
Yep, yep.
And so there were a number of charges that were drawn up.
Yep.
And then once the warrant was issued by the courts, the arrest warrant was issued by the courts, there's then a process of going through the federal government to get an international arrest warrant.
Yeah.
And this extradition process underway, because you're then dealing with another country, so it's got to go through the federal government. And so once those international warrants are then issued, they can then be executed by a country that Australia has an extradition treaty with. Obviously, we have it with the United States. And, I remember there was a bit of a stuff up from the Canberra end, the Attorney General's Department, with regards to the documents, and the judge in the district court in White Plains, upper state New York, was going to dismiss the whole thing because the paperwork was wrong.
Right.
And, of course, there was no PDF files in those days. We did everything via this thing called a facsimile machine. And we worked when the FBI and the prosecutor was working day shift, we were working night shift, so we could do all these documents and vice versa.
Wow.
So that was a whole process in itself. And after Anne and William had been arrested in the United States on the perjury charges, they were taken to a prison and held in a prison until the extradition was either granted or was dismissed. And this went on for a month or so. They refused to the extradition, and two things happened. One, Anne said that she was not well. She had a heart condition.
Yep.
She couldn't travel. So I said to the FBI and the prosecutor of the United States, well, we'll bring a doctor. So we actually took a police doctor from Melbourne on the extradition to cater for her. The second thing that's happened was that Bill and Anne was in separate locations in the prison. Yeah. There was a murder in Bill's cell. One of his cellmates was murdered. And Bill said, that's it, I've had enough, I'm getting out of here. So in the end, they both agreed to the extradition back to Australia. Right. And so that extradition process then commenced.
Wow. And look, because I think in the documentary it said, one of the children said that Bill was quite well known in his own field or in his own style of work. How did those two meet? Were they youngsters, or did they meet later in life?
No, Anne was previously married, and Bill was married to a woman who somehow ended up in a psychiatric hospital. He was apparently good-looking in his younger days. Yeah. He was from Gippsland and had his own business, and was pretty well-known and well-to-do in that particular area. You've got to remember that Anne was the daughter of a railway worker, and she was born in Sale, Victoria. So she met him, and it was obviously that I think that she probably understood how much better off she would be with him. Yeah. He was a well-spoken person, well-known. And so married William, and Burns' first wife, my understanding is ended up in a hospital.
Yeah, because also Anne's upbringing, as you say, they were poor, but her mum also was in and out of psych hospitals, wasn't she?
Yes. Yeah. When she was younger. So whatever the treatment was in those days, but that makes no excuse.
Oh no, definitely not.
I mean, I've said to people at the time of Anne's death a couple of years ago, I was asked by the press, how I felt, and I said it was the most happiest day of my life. Yeah. That the witch was dead. I used the B word instead of the W word. Yeah. But I was quite upfront about it. It was one of the most happiest days of my life because she was the most evil person that I ever came across in my 18 years of policing. What she did to children, what she did to cult members, sadly she lived right into her 90s. She died with Alzheimer's. Yeah. And the sick part about it was, she would cradle one of those baby dolls in the hospital. Yeah, it's just an incredible story. The amount of lives that she destroyed and the amount of people that she affected.
Really, we haven't spoken much about the children, and it's what she did with those aunties. And you have to wonder why the aunties just went along with everything she said. But the children were actually beaten for just wetting the bed or taking a bit of extra food and things like that. They were menial things, weren't they?
Yeah, they were, and they received dunkings in buckets of water until they could not nearly breathe and so forth. But you have to understand, Daniel, that many of the sect followers, and I don't excuse the two main aunties for what they did, and one of them I actually spoke to at length with a female detective in the United Kingdom, who actually gave us a lot of evidence. I don't excuse what they did, but they too, in a way, were also victims of Anne.
Yeah.
But they were adults and they must be always held accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
But they believed that Anne was Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form. And if you're told to do something by Jesus Christ and you're a believer in that cult, you would do it.
You're going to do it, yeah.
Now, for you and I, who I hope we're both rational people, we would say, how bloody bizarre is that? But to them, it's not bizarre. Many people look at what happened in World War II in Hitler's Germany. Now, how could people, normal, sensible people, have done that?
Yeah.
Some of those horrific crimes. No different. You know, their minds were manipulated. Yeah. Through propaganda, through a whole range of things that they had a belief in the one person.
Yeah.
Even in today's world, there are societies like that. So,
with her having the houses all around the world, they were saying in the documentary that, one of the girls said that she was taken over to the UK and spent about a month on LSD. And I mean, I was going to say, well, how do they get them through the country? But as you said, they had all these people that were signing paperwork. So passports and all those sort of things probably wouldn't have been an issue for them to get through.
The child that the girl that you're talking with sadly passed away, who and I equate that in a lot of it to the cult. And she was a terrific person. I was honoured to have been asked to give a eulogy at her funeral.
Wow.
But, she was taken at the age of 14 to Broome Farm in Kent, and she went through what they called a clearing. The clearing was the administering of LSD to the children. One of my biggest regrets is, when people have said, all you charged Anne and William was perjury on a document. Well, sadly, that's right. And sadly, that was the only charge that at the end of the day that they could not beat, because they forged a document. Documents don't lie. People lie on documents.
Yeah.
But, to charge them with the administering of drugs to children and others, you actually need the drug. And obviously we don't have the drug. We never had the drug. But there is no doubt 1,000% that through two eminent psychiatrists at the time that were cult members, people, including children, were administered LSD at Anne's instruction.
Yeah. And did those psychiatrists who were in the cult, who were working with her, for her, did they get struck off afterwards, or was there not enough evidence to remove them?
One of them left the cult all of a sudden, and then went and worked in charge of a psychiatric hospital up in Victoria's northeast. He knew what he'd done wrong, and his wife was also a cult member. Yeah. And she ended up marrying another cult member, whose wife married another cult member, and that woman was one of the aunties who was the one I spoke to in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And then the other psychiatrist ended up just practicing general medicine, which he did up until his retirement in most recent years, I'm told, but he was still a GP in Ferntree Gully.
Well, look, I mean, it took you 4.5 years to get through all this, and it's no wonder, because it was such a tangled web that you had to try and work out what was going on.
We were fortunate that when the task force was established in December '89, I had a great detective senior sergeant, Peter Spence, who was very smart, and we searched a lot of documents, and we found on one of the documents, Peter actually found this signature from the lawyer, and we'd found out that this lawyer was Anne's lawyer.
Right.
And he left the cult months earlier out of a big blue with Anne.
Yeah.
So we issued an arrest warrant for perjury on this particular document by the solicitor.
Yeah.
So one Monday morning, Peter and I fronted up at Camperdown to the west of Melbourne, about 3-4 hours to the west of Melbourne. Small, sizable community in Melbourne, in Victoria's southwestern. We marched in at 9 o'clock into the solicitor's office, past the receptionist, introduced ourselves, arrested Peter, walked him up the street, across one part of the street, down the other side of the street, into the police station. Of course, in a small town, people, what's going on? And we charged him, and we said to him, Peter, think about it. And he was angry at her, angry. Said, if you're prepared to assist us, these charges on you will proceed to court.
Yep.
I'll consider giving character evidence for you and how you cooperated with the police. So about a week later, Peter rang and said, I'd like to see you. So we went and saw Peter at his home with his wife, who was also a cult member, who had been introduced. They had been introduced by Anne.
Yep.
And Peter said, I'm prepared to tell you everything. So for about the next 3 months, I would pick him up from home in Olinda, which is about an hour east of Melbourne, drive him into the detective's office in St Kilda Road near central Melbourne, and take a handwritten statement, take him home and repeat that day after day for about 3 months.
Wow.
And we went through document after document that he'd forged on behalf of Anne and got the story behind the births and the properties and so forth. So at the end of the day, it was 365 pages, handwritten pages of evidence.
Wow.
And it was through Peter, towards the end, that he was in contact with one of the aunties who had moved to the United Kingdom that had been up in Ilden, and I spoke with her on the phone. We needed to go and talk to her in London. Yep. And that was in those days in the early 90s to try and get a detective to go to London from Victoria Police. There's a whole bureaucracy that had to happen to go through the department, the minister and so forth. And I remember, I had spoke to her on the phone this day with Peter in the room, getting excited. Yes, she's prepared to turn Queen's evidence and tell us everything. And I had to go to the toilet. And so I said to Peter, excuse me, and I left the room. And I went to the toilet. Now, you might laugh at this. So I'm standing at the urinal, minding my own business, of course, and standing next to me came the Assistant Commissioner in charge of crime.
Okay.
He said to me, so Lex, how's it going? I said, boss, sir, this is what's just happened. And so, she's prepared to speak to us. This was just before Christmas of 1990. Yeah. She's prepared to speak to us, but so I'm going to sit back, do the paperwork, see how. So I'll probably end up on your desk, and she could blow the whole case up. And she said, "Go and book yourself a ticket now. Go." Right, go. Did the paperwork basically there and then, signed off there and then, and about a week later, myself and a female detective were on the plane to London, where we spent 3 months interviewing her. But whilst the female detective interviewed the former cult member, who was a nurse, one of the aunties, I did inquiries in London and located actually one of the triplets that had been registered in New Zealand. Right. And then took a statement from him, located him, spoke to him and his then wife in a hotel room for about 3 or 4 weeks. So it was all part of the investigation to get sufficient evidence and to see what was happening. And then, as I said at the start, the last 12 months I was put in charge. The senior sergeant had left the task force by then. I was put in charge, and we had 12 months to clean it up, and resulted in Anne and William being extradited back to Australia. And one of the things that back in December 1989, a reporter said to us, if you find her, you'll never charge her. If you charge her, you'll never get her back to this country. If you get her back to this country, you'll never get her before a court. If you get her before your court, you'll never get a conviction. That's a fair mighty challenge from the media.
Yeah.
So we found her, we charged her, we brought her back, and it was Anne and Bill who said the words guilty to the charge of perjury. And I was delighted, but I was really angry at the end of the day with the $5,000 penalty that they got for the perjury on the documents after the years and years and years of hard work, but more so the years and years of trauma that they had caused on children, the lies that they had told on children, drugs, the deception on mothers and fathers, what she had done to cult members. Sadly, that was the only thing we could get. But I suppose at the end of the day, we, the task force, dispelled the myth of Anne being Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form. I worked with every member of the task force, all 13, were tremendous people and devoted to it when they were on the task force. And when I look back, could we have done more? Possibly. But in those days, of course, we didn't have the technology we have today. But, I remember saying to the press, when I got asked about her death, I said, well, I suppose in 3 days' time I'll find out if she is Jesus Christ. Well, she never came back, did she? So I said that it's a bit of a bit of a sly, smart aleck type comment. Yeah, and I still keep in contact with a small number of the children who are now adults, who are great people, beautiful people. That you just have to take your hats off to all of them. And as you'll gather, I won't use their names. I won't disclose who they are. I won't disclose where they live.
Yeah.
That's their life.
Yeah.
And my sole journey about relaying this story and talking about this story is to keep people's awareness that these things, whilst they might not be able to happen in our society any longer because of checks and balances, that means they couldn't happen.
Yeah.
So,
and look, I think your awareness, like you say that, would it have been better to get a better conviction? You got her, as you said, to admit her guilt, and you got awareness to what had happened, where other police might not have got the awareness out there of what had happened to these kids and what happened to, the people involved. It's brought a big awareness out there. And those kids, they'd be forever grateful for you for helping them to unearth this.
Yeah, although, I got the report up and running and so forth, and I'm friends with quite a number of the kids, now adults, it was a huge team effort by the team. And I would have hoped that anyone with a badge that was in my position that went to that school fire would have done exactly the same thing as I did. But because when you understand that the treatment these children came under and the resistance to do anything about it in those days, to me there were a couple of career-defining moments on the task force, and I say that by challenging the department or those higher in ranks, and could have gone either way. But I was fortunate that I had good people, good officers that listened, that heard what I had to say, and had a belief that what I was saying was right, and therefore said, no, we had to do something. And as I said, I can't take anything away from the magnificent team members that we had on the task force that really did a lot of the grunt work with the kids, doing the interviews with the kids. And, although Anne and Bill were only found guilty or pleaded guilty to the perjury charge, it was about demystifying the myth.
Yeah.
And sadly, even after that, people still believed in right up until her death, and there are still people today, small number, who are still alive that believe that she is Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form. Still have that underlying, only a very, very, very handful, I'm told. But be that on their head.
And look, I think it's also important to just go over that. I think it was 7 or 8 of the members of the sect actually were brought to trial as well, weren't they, for various things? During
our task force and also through the inquiry through the Blackburn Community Policing Squad and Federal Police, there were a number of aunties and older cult members that were brought before the Ringwood Magistrates Court on fraud charges against the Commonwealth through the health services, community services, falsification of claims and so forth. And a number of them were also, I think it was one doctor, and there were a number of nurses and so forth. So, they were treated, they were dealt with, which was good as well. But sadly, not all of them were dealt with, and sadly, a number of them retired from their profession with an unblemished record, when in actual fact they should have had a bloody blemished record.
Oh,
but
definitely.
Nothing could happen with them.
No. Look, is there anything else that you think we need to talk about? I mean, I think we've covered quite a bit here, Lex. I did want to just add that when I was speaking to my mum on the weekend, she said, I remember the family because my mum and my sister worked for CSV, which was Community Services Victoria at the time. They both worked in separate houses looking after vulnerable children. Yeah. And she said that they'd got the call either the early hours of the morning to go and meet somewhere to take on these kids. Yeah. And she was only there for about half a day, and then they worked out what staff they were going to have that was working.
Yeah, and that would have been on the 14th of August 1987. Wow. I can tell you the date.
Yeah.
That's when that would have happened, the morning of, because that's when the raids happened. You know, I take my hat off to the survivors, as I call them, the children, the now adults, but the survivors. They've done a powerful job in normalising their lives in many, many ways and become great parents themselves of some beaut kids. There is still some sadness about a number of the cult followers, some who are still alive, some of the children and so forth. But my hat's off to those survivors, very much so, because you imagine all of a sudden your whole world has turned upside down, and who you thought were your mother and father are not your mother and father when you learn the truth about who your natural parents are. Yeah. I feel for the natural parents who gave up their children in a deceptive manner, that they were deceived by Anne. You know, those that went through that horror, and years later having police knock on their door. You know, and I also honour and testament to the police members that were on the task force under Peter Spencer's initial stewardship. I can't thank Peter enough for what he did and taught me. And really, I was allowed for 4.5 years through some great senior officers of Victoria Police to bring this whole thing to an end, because it had to be resolved at the end.
Yeah.
And I think some of the lessons out of Operation Forest, as it was called, you know, we saw the number of private adoption agencies reduce from, I think it was 27 to about 3 or 5 now.
Wow.
Today.
Yeah.
You know, processes in birth, deaths and marriages were tightened up significantly here.
Yeah.
I think in other jurisdictions. And, you know, there are some great people who actually took care of the children, you know, the survivors, and a number who still today are great friends with those adults.
Yeah.
Who are now the survivors, survivors who are now adults. So there's a whole raft of people, but it's interesting. You get your pager goes off in the middle of the night. You ring D24, which is the police headquarters for emergency call, and you get directed to this school fire, and you think you're just going out to a normal school fire, and lo and behold, you know, that takes you down a journey of 4.5 years. And I never forget the police doctor who I mentioned at the start, who I thought was crazy when he first told me about Anne.
Yeah.
He said to me, "Don't get involved, Lex, because if you get involved, it will be with you for life." And I thought to myself, that's a bizarre comment. Well, I'm still with it, insofar as, you know, keeping in some contact with some of the kids.
Yeah.
And now I'm talking about it again as an education for the community. And those of us who are in positions, or those people in positions of authority, you know, in state government and federal government, and also the senior bureaucracies, must always be on their guard, because there is evil people out there prepared to manipulate children and others for their own aim.
Yeah. And I did want to ask you, how do you think your mental health went through the whole thing? Because you would have had ups and downs, and then at the end of it, I can just imagine an outpouring.
Yeah, it was, there were a number of my close friends who worried about me during the time. I didn't realise that, but I remember one episode when we got the phone call from the FBI at midnight, they'd arrested Anne and Bill.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to realise that at that stage, 2 members of the task force at that stage had their own mental health issues caused by the inquiry.
Yeah.
There'd been a lot of issues.
Yeah.
You know, hearing the stories of the kids. I remember going on, I think I was on the 10th floor, of the 412 St Kilda Road, and I had one of the survivors, one of the kids there, who was helping us with because Anne had contacted her, and that's how we found out she was in the States. And the police doctor was there and members of the team. I walked out of the office, I walked down the corridor to the mess room, and I just destroyed the mess room. I threw chairs and tables over. I broke down. I cried my eyes out, whatever. And I didn't realise that I was suffering from any form of stress and so forth. But it was all that pent up of that 4 years, work and anger that all of a sudden came out. So that was my release valve. And now through my other experiences in CFA, but also in policing, I talk quite openly about the need to take care of yourself and to recognise when you do need to chat, you do need counselling, you do need to seek out assistance and help. And I'm more than happy to put my hand up anytime and say, as a leader of the task force, but as a leader of my region during the devastating fires of Black Saturday, or the loss of 5 firefighters in 1998 at Linton, just because you're the leader doesn't mean you don't get affected, and you've got to give licence to everybody else to talk about mental health. And the best way you can do that is by saying to people, I'm seeking help. So definitely. I'm seeking help. Boy, that means you're more than welcome to seek help, because it affects us. PTSD affects us all in a different way, but it does affect us. And, that macho stuff, should be right, get on with it. Those days are gone. I've been involved in police shooting and expected to be back on the divisional van 6 hours after I put a bloke in hospital with a firearm. That would not happen today. It doesn't happen today, and that's good that it doesn't happen today. But leaders need to talk about it.
Definitely.
Own it and give licence to others to seek assistance.
Because when they see someone like you that says, yes, look, I broke down, I needed to get some counselling, I needed to chat to people, then they understand it's okay for them.
Correct.
And I just wanted to go back over as well, because, you said with the frustration, you threw chairs around and sort of messed up the mess room. And the reason was as well is because with Anne having all these properties all over the world, you were trying to track her all the time, weren't you? And she was moving everywhere. So it wasn't like you just went, she's there and we can go and get her. She was flighty.
Took us quite a while to track her down. And she made we were looking at the United Kingdom, we were looking at the United States. We had no idea where she was, and because you got to remember the IT systems were a bit slow in those days, or non-existent. And it was one Sunday night she made a fatal error and rang one of the children, and who rang me and said, I think she's in the United States. So the very next morning I picked up the phone. I asked the international operator, as you do in those days, to hook me up to the FBI office in New York City. So we hooked up to the phone in New York City, and a woman by the name of Hilda Kogut, who was a special agent with the FBI, who I came to know very well, picked up the phone, and my first words said to her now, don't hang up. I'm not a nut. I want to tell you a story. I'm a copper, and I need your help. And fortunately, we got the right agent. And then the rest is history. Brilliant,
Lex. Brilliant. Look, it's been so good talking to you, and I like how you ended it up and, spoke about it's acceptable for men to go and get mental health, because that's great for men to hear.
No worries. All right. Well, I'm glad I could help, Daniel.
No worries. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much, Lex.
Thanks, Daniel.
All right. Bye-bye. Well, that was another episode of Life Changes You. If you want to contact us, we're available on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And we also have a website, lifechangesyou.com.au. So until next time, take care of each other, and thanks for listening.